So welcome everyone. Great to welcome you to the first of our Methods Mondays series. First, I want to thank Dr. Suzanne de Janasz for joining us and being the first presenter in this series. Today, we will speak about in-depth interviews in peace and conflict resolution research methods. Dr. Suzanne de Janasz is a professor of conflict analysis and also a professor of management at George Mason University. She specializes in negotiation and dispute resolution and has quite a bit of experience with interviews. So I'm Susan Allen. I'll be hosting this session, but turn it over to Dr. de Janasz for a presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I had to look at my clock. It's 12. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Susan. You can call me Suzanne, you can call me Dr. D, like a lot of my students do, thanks to my difficult last name, or you can call me Dr. de Janasz. Either way, I am going to, we have an hour. I easily could talk for an hour, but that's not my plan. I'm going to try to shoot for, Naomi knows, we work together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some assumptions about how in-depth this method conversation should be. And anytime you have any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or less so put a note in the chat. To kind of focus in 3 different places is not exactly what I'd like to do. Maybe Naomi, if you want to kind of keep an eye on the chat and let me know. One other thing that I want to make clear before I jump right in. Yes, as you noticed from Susan's introduction, I have a joint appointment with the business school and the Carter School. And full disclosure, the majority of my professional career has been in the business school. So for those of you who are here thinking, great, I'm going to learn all about interviews in the peace and conflict space and, dealing with groups of people who have been marginalized and terrorized and are trying to pursue peace as a path. That's not where all my experience has been. However, the method of using interviews will apply regardless. So I just want to manage people's expectations. We good? All right, cool. So let me share my screen. Can you see the interview screen?
Yes, indeed. Yep, you got it going.
Honestly, when you pull up Zoom and it says you want to share, here's the windows that we see and here are the other windows. That didn't even come up.
That was different this time.
Really, really odd. Okay, enough of that. All right, so yes, welcome to the first inaugural session of Methods Mondays. We're going to talk about in-depth interviews. That's me. And for more information, let me know if you're interested or I'll give a copy to Susan. One of our Carter School graduates with a master's, and I think it was last year, Julie Katz, she assisted me in the development of this book chapter that was published last year. And so I'd like to give her a nod in being a part of some of the information that is here that I'm presenting. So here's our plan. And I found a new pretty presentation from PowerPoint. So, we could argue that interviewing is an art, okay, and therefore it applies. But I was tired of all the same boring PowerPoint frames. So this one I thought was really pretty. So bear with me. All right, so here's our plan. The first question is, when you think about all of the different ways that you can gather data for your research, the question here is, well, why interviews? And just to kind of like step back, of course, we're looking in a grander scheme of things of the scientific research method, right? What are my hypotheses? Where do they come from? What previous literature or empirical studies have led me to want to ask these questions? What else do I know? What don't I know? In what context, et cetera? And you have a lot of options in terms of gathering data. You can use survey instruments. You can look at secondary data, data that has existed and is in databases, et cetera. And again, you could use focus groups. There are lots of different ways to gather data. So our focus in this hour is going to be why interviews? What are the advantages and what are the purposes of using interviews? Well, first of all, if you've ever collected data using a Likert scale of 1 to 5, it's not very rich, right? How satisfied are employees about this new culture? It's a 3.97. What does that mean? I mean, really, what does that mean? What story can you tell? Oh, I just heard a big sigh. What story can you tell? There's not a lot of richness to the data, and there's certainly not a lot of richness to the medium of using a standard quantitative Likert-based instrument. So one of the benefits of having interviews as a mechanism for gathering data is it's holistic. It's not guided necessarily by these predetermined, validated instruments that contain concepts from the field of study and these tested and validated items where an item analysis is done. I won't bore you, that might be another session, right? But because this process is much more holistic, it really allows for a more rich understanding of the phenomenon under interest. Another reason why I think interviews are so helpful is similar to that. It's this kind of inside out process. It's not, I'm the researcher, I know what to expect, I know what I'm looking for, so here's this framework, you tell me. No, it's the opposite. It's, I have an idea, which is not to say that, you could use interviews for exploratory kind of research. You could also use interviews for more established ideas and fields of research. But in this case, the idea that you have the flexibility to really focus on the subject and their perspective. How have they responded to this question? And more importantly, why? Say more. Give me an example. Can you share how you felt at that time? So again, it's rich, but it's also driven by the subject much more so than driven by the researcher. Does that make sense? Just a couple nods of heads, great. The other reason I think interviews are so great is because of these previous two steps, because you haven't created these, to some degree, unfair constraints on what it is that you're studying. This allows for new perspectives and research questions to come about. It's emergent, right? If you are relatively unstructured in your approach to interviewing, you may not only find some answers to the hypotheses that you kind of came into this research with, but you may have come up with new questions because through this holistic kind of balanced, not necessarily researcher driven, but more partnership kind of process, there are things that you didn't even think about asking that emerged from the interview data. So I think that's really exciting. And even another benefit, while we're in this data collection mode, if I'm interviewing Susan and I hear something interesting, even though I have a protocol, I could say, wow, that, in my head, well, that was unexpected. Say more about that. Why do you think that's important? And so it not only allows iteration with the person, but it also kind of allows iteration with the tool. Because when you have a quantitative survey-based instrument, if you start changing that tool, midstream, you mess up your data, right? But when you're interviewing, you can, without too much problem, start to kind of iterate a little bit, maybe the order. We'll come back to some of the challenges to that, but you can iterate a little bit real time and kind of follow the path of the interviews in a way that makes sense. And finally, another key advantage, I think, of interviews is that when you're looking at phenomena that have a long arc, and certainly, development of peace in an otherwise high conflict area is one. You don't do an intervention and tomorrow things are different. It really enables a greater opportunity to look at a phenomenon over time where what's happening within this phenomenon may be intended or planned, or not, or both. And so, for example, one thing you'll hear me draw from is I do research in the area of careers. And the definition of a career is the long and unfolding story of somebody's professional life. It doesn't necessarily follow this pattern, but it's for many people, it's this kind of like, well, I thought I would do this, but, and so you can't, yes, I mean, a quantitative survey instrument can gather a snapshot of data at a time, but the interviews allow for a bit more of the story preceding, the story during, and even here are my thoughts about the future. I see there are 2 items in chat. Should I pause for a moment and see what's in there?
I think it's just a couple shares, not a question specifically.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to keep going. So you have some approaches, and they're fairly, straightforward, right? A structured approach to interviewing is one where both the content, the questions, and the sequencing of questions is fairly rigid, right? And this is important in gathering data. And of course, gathering assumes that at some point you're going to be analyzing the data for being able to compare across and within these data points that you gather. So a great example of this is a job interview. It's important that a job interview is structured, not only for reasons of legality, right? You don't want to ask persons of different backgrounds, different questions that would be illegal and discriminatory, but moreover, you want to be able to compare various candidates for the job. And if you ask different questions in a different sequence, how can you make that comparison? So the most structured and formal of interview approaches is the structured approach. The semi-structured approach does kind of follow a pattern. It's got kind of an arc in mind, like from the more general to the more specific, or from the more comfortable kinds of questions to the more maybe slightly uncomfortable kinds of questions. But they're generally open-ended, and they allow for moments of deep dive, like, oh, that's really interesting. So for example, another area of research and publication of mine has been in the area of mentoring, and one in particular where I used interviews as a mechanism for gathering data. I was looking at, with a colleague, the mentoring of CEOs. And when this piece was published in 2015, it was kind of groundbreaking. All right, I'm patting myself on the back, but because up till that point, most of the research that has been done on mentoring has been with students, employees, persons of color, members of other underrepresented groups. The assumption is if you're the CEO, you're at the apex of your career. What could you possibly need or want mentoring for? It hadn't been studied. And so because it was a fairly new phenomenon, we felt that it was really important to get that kind of qualitative data. We also triangulated it with empirical data, and another time I could talk about that. But as an example of open-ended questions, a little background. So these CEOs and near CEOs that I was interviewing, and these went from a half hour to an hour in general, and they were not recorded, and we'll talk about recording versus not recording later. They were involved in a formal mentoring program for which many of them, their companies, paid a non-insignificant fee for a professional mentor, for lack of a better term. And they talked all about this experience currently with this mentor. And at some point, I might say something like, wow, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. And I may clarify things that I've captured in my notes. And then I'll say, so tell me, how did this experience with this mentor compare to other experiences you've had with other mentors? And just a slight side story, because I think it's really interesting. An answer I frequently got was, oh, I've never been mentored before. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. And again, why interviews are so powerful. If I were untrained, or if that were a structured questionnaire, okay, next. But actually, I didn't do that. I said, really? You've never been mentored before. That's unusual. Have you ever had somebody who has been a sounding board for you, somebody who's opened doors for you, somebody for whom they've had similar experiences and they can share with you that, oh yeah, tons of those. Okay, so we call that mentoring. I mean, I'm not so smart ass when I'm right, but the whole idea is, if we were in a very structured approach, there's really not the room or the space to be able to, or the agency to be able to kind of like take this deep dive. And so, it becomes, again, much more of a balanced process, as opposed to you just sit there and answer my questions, but rather we're engaging in a dialogue together. And then finally, the unstructured interviews are really, really open-ended, and they don't necessarily follow a pattern. And those are a little bit harder to kind of get into. I'd say most of the work that I do falls into the semi-structured category, because I come in with a question or two, like what is interesting to me. So here's another example, and you can see how it compares to the previous question. Because again, a career is this, 43-year long process. A question like, reflecting on your career, what has had the greatest impact on your success? Now, you may be thinking, well, how much more open-ended is that than the previous one? Well, here's the thing. Mentoring is one process, one avenue for learning, for growing, for developing, for improving one's skills, abilities, and knowledge. It's not the only one. You're here in a master's or a PhD program. That is a mechanism for which you could improve your career success. You could take a year off and find yourself or whatever, right? There's a lot of things that we could do that would impact. When you don't ask the specific question, tell me about mentoring, tell me about graduate programs, tell me about special programs, tell me about coaches, you'll get the answer to the question you've asked. But if the question is far more open-ended and vague, I find that the first thing they respond to is in fact the most important thing to them. So there's a weight to what comes out of their mouths when you don't drill them on the topic, which is more semi-structured, but rather just kind of open up. Tell me, what are the things that you think about most when it comes to your sense of freedom, right? So you're not imposing a structure or a format on that. Any questions? We'll come to advantages and disadvantages. And whoever, sorry, I'm just looking at Beltina, we can come back. You can come back and ask me that question, especially when you raise your hand, because then I'll see it. All right, so moving on. What does it look like? What are the steps to actually getting into this interview method? So first of all, right, let's assume that you personally or working with an investigator, you've already received IRB approval. But we have to start there, right? Because you can't just say, I'd like to study X and go and do it. I mean, years ago we could, and we did, but because of concerns about doing no harm, as scientists, we should do no harm, we have to be careful, because even when you say, oh, I'm asking about careers, how could this possibly be triggering? How could this possibly hurt someone psychologically? Well, that's what the IRBs are for. These institutional review boards are there specifically to look at your plan, raise any red flags that there might need to be raised, and then work with you and talk with you, in an iterative process to refine your method in order to do as little harm as possible. And interviews, while they're more rich, they're more intense in some ways. So it's probably even more important than it is than just having a quantitative coded questionnaire that people go on Qualtrics and answer, and then that's the end of that. Okay, so you got IRB approval. You have done a literature review. You know more or less what we know, and you have some interesting hypotheses about what we don't know. Well, before you even develop this interview protocol, assuming that it's not the completely unstructured, all the other rules for developing survey questions apply, right? So it's not just, oh, I always wanted to ask this, but rather, what are ways of asking questions that are less likely to bias the responses, less likely to muddy the responses? So for example, you may have heard the term in another methods class, double-barreled question. Do you find yourself happy and productive at work during most of the time? Well, happy is a very different construct than productive. And if you look at surveys that you sometimes receive, in your email, I find so many of these errors in surveys. Why do people do it? Well, A, they may not have the training, but B, if I can ask my question in one instead of two questions, it'll be quicker, right? So, again, you have to really take a look at these questions. Imagine yourself answering them. If you would have trouble answering the question because you couldn't pick one or the other, or abbreviations are terrible, you might be very clear and familiar with an abbreviation, but somebody else does not, especially when your subjects are, for whom English is not their native tongue, and you are a native English speaker. So these are a lot of assumptions you have to think about. And you also, like any survey, you generally don't want to start off with demographics. Do you identify as male or female first? Again, that could be triggering. Most surveys that I see and the ones I construct have demographics in the end. If you have demographics in a survey, an interview at all, and we could talk about that. So again, understand what good question writing is all about and follow that process. One last thing I didn't mention, but it's in that note, closed. So that closed questions are questions that can be answered with a single yes or no response. Are you happy or sad is another example of a closed question. Tell me, how are you feeling right now is an open question. And you want to have open questions. You want to give these prompts that enable respondents to expound. If you ask closed questions, yes, no questions, do you think, here's a scenario, an ethical scenario. Do you think it's right or wrong? Right? So you have to be really careful about having these open-ended questions. So you create your draft. The next thing you want to do is you want to test your draft, your protocol. And what I have done in the past is I would look for a little bit of diversity based on my phenomenon of interest. And so one of the things I've done recently, for example, I have been looking at gig workers, particularly Airbnb hosts. One of my research questions, and this is something we just published a couple of weeks ago, was, with all this talk about work-family conflict, it's been my opinion that as more and more people have moved to gig work, like Lyft and Uber and Airbnb and all that, there's this what's the word I'm looking for? They haven't found necessarily an easier way of managing work and family. It's a different kind of conflict. So just because you don't have the big boss looking over you doesn't mean that you don't have work-family conflict. It's just in a different name, a different form. In any case, in order to test that hypothesis, we actually started with a few preliminary interviews where we had some questions and we asked, the research team asked different people, somebody who was doing it full-time, somebody who's doing it part-time, somebody who was older, somebody who was younger, male, female, in the Netherlands, in the US. So, I felt by having some diversity in mind, we did about 10 or 12 preliminary interviews. And then we got together and said, okay, did these questions elicit the kind of responses that we thought would help us answer the research questions. I also put a note there, save your best respondents for later. The people who you think would be the most interesting, don't waste your shot on a preview test or a preview interview, right? Save them for later, because A, you don't want to bother your friends and again, important people more than once. And B, if you've interviewed them once, can you say that there's not any bias when you interview them a second time? So another reason why I suggest saving your best respondents for later. Okay, so you have this test, you have preliminary data. Again, you're analyzing. And this is both from the content, but also if you have a research team, hey, when you were doing these interviews, what kinds of issues came up? Did you wind up answering or having them answer questions much later in the protocol? Maybe we should put them up earlier since they come about naturally. And another thing that I find, this is one of my favorite questions in any interview I've ever performed. At the very end of the interview, I ask something along the lines of, thanks again, I really appreciate your taking the time and providing your honest feedback to these questions. Tell me, are there other questions that I haven't asked you on this topic, but I should have? It's a great question. It's a great question because, again, you as the researcher have put your imprint on your draft protocol. You may not have really captured all the potential intricacies of these phenomena. So by asking a question like that, especially in this testing phase, you might come up with a mind-blowing question like, wow, I really need to kind of embed this one in there as well. So I think that's a really important point. So you have this preliminary analysis, you do some revising, and you also make some decisions. Maybe there's some questions that need to go. Maybe some need to be modified somewhat, and maybe some need to be added. And so again, this is an iterative process. Would you take another iteration and do another test? Sure. Depends on how much data you're going to get, how many resources you have available to you. But again, you may have heard this before, garbage in, garbage out. If your instrument for collecting data is flawed, the data will be flawed. So never forget that, garbage in, garbage out. I can't tell you how many times I've seen professional surveys that are crap. I mean, it's just like, why are you wasting time, mine and everybody else's, where there are all these flaws in this survey? I see it always. And then finally, when you get to that point of, I think we have a workable protocol, you might revise the final protocol to include for the researcher, not for the participant to see, probes. Like, here's a place where you might, these are some potential follow-up questions or clarifying questions. And of course, you need to train the interviewers, especially those that don't have a lot of experience doing interviews. So, the final protocol will be questions that are ones that the researchers will ask verbatim as written on the protocol. And then there are those that'll be kind of like hidden chance to like, oh, here's a place where you might do this or probe for this or probe for that. And those are just notes to the interviewers. Do we have a question?
Bill has just added something else to ask at the end.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm gonna have to speed up just a little bit, I think, but so far is the speed okay? Not too detailed, not too, all right. I only see a couple of faces, but I'm gonna go with that. All right, so you have your protocol. Around the same time, you also need to think about what your sampling strategy is. See, aren't these pretty colors? All right, so you're thinking about who is it that you're going to be interviewing? What are the questions that would screen them in or out? And this is really important because, again, the thing about interviews that is much different from using instruments, quantitative instruments, is it's very resource heavy, very resource heavy. And so you really only want to get the data that you're going to use. You don't want to waste people's time. You don't want to waste your time. So, it really bears some thinking. And I'll give you another example using the Airbnb example, I think, because that will really bring this to bear. So if you have ever stayed in an Airbnb, and I've stayed at many, the people whom you might meet, maybe, right? Because not all Airbnbs are shares, right? They could be another property where you would never see the host, but some of them are, a guest room inside a house, or, the top floor, or whatever the case may be. Well, since we're asking about work-family conflict in this research, we decided, for example, anybody who is a host, but is not the person who is actually sharing space with the guests, is not of interest to us. If their job is to manage properties, buy them, and hire other people to host and take care of the guests, they're not relevant to our research. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, whom to interview just because they see themselves as an Airbnb host, in that case, that was not relevant, and we wanted to be sure that we were able to screen in and screen out. Another thing in this sampling strategy, you may not have heard this term before. I learned it many, many years ago in my, I think even undergrad, and I never forgot it because it was so powerful. The GAS, or GAS trade-off, is generalizable, accurate, and simple. And I think it was Carl Weick, who is very well known, still around, in qualitative research, sometimes in business, sometimes communication. He's done work in a lot of firefighters and other interesting people that he's done research with. And he says, and I agree, that you could have at best 2, but never 3 of these. Meaning, if you do a really, really good job of specifying your audience of interest, you can have an accurate study for which you can predict accurately within confidence intervals that this behavior within this group could result in this outcome. So the more that you tighten your population of interest, the more accurate your results will be, but the less generalizable, right? So if you want to say, all teenagers or all people in conflict-ridden areas, right? And you're only looking at in Mali, right? So you get accuracy within Mali, for example, but you lose generalizability across all groups that are in this situation. The S, simplicity, sometimes, and I'm guilty of this early in my career, you want to put everything in the kitchen sink, right? In your dissertation, you're like, well, there's this issue, and then there's this research that informs it, and then there's sociology and mathematics, and let's just get all of this in there so that I can show that, don't. But then you lose the simplicity of it all, right? The parsimony. How clear is it that these are key variables that impact these outcome variables? So again, I don't have much more time to get into this GAS trade-off. And if I can find the article where this first came from, I don't know that I read it, but I learned it in a class. I just think it's so important. Generalizability, accuracy, and simplicity. So when you think about whom to interview, realize you'll never get all 3. You'll never get all 3. You'll be lucky to get 2 of those. How many people to target? Well, this is a good question. Depends on, obviously, your hypotheses, but you could have too few, right? Because each interview, in a sense, is a case study. And where do you generalize from case study to, we could predict that, in this population, these situations would result in these outcomes. But you can also have too many. There's one finding that I read, that when you are interviewing and you have some basic ideas, so you're at least semi-structured in your approach, you start to get to a saturation point with about 60 interviewees. So finding that point between how many, and of course the resources required, right? It is very time consuming to not only get agreement on doing an interview with a person, but to actually do the interview with the person and to transcribe if you're transcribing, and to do, I know a lot of faculty who, whenever you talked about qualitative research, their answer was, that sounds like a great post-tenure project. And the reason for that is, if you're in a career situation where getting publications is essential for getting tenure, this is a longer process, longer in gathering the data, longer in analyzing the data, and in some cases, harder to publish because there's fewer, at least in the fields that I'm aware of, there are fewer studies that are published that are all qualitative, and far more that are published that are all quantitative. And then there's something in between. So again, that's another thing to think about in your sampling strategy. And the mechanism matters. Is it face-to-face? Well, that's going to take a lot of time to travel to the person. And there are benefits and disadvantages. Is it recorded versus you're taking notes simultaneously? You could also argue that another interview structure could be, here is an email that contains my questions. Please respond to my email with your answers. That's legitimate. It's not the kind of interview process that I generally take, but it is legitimate. So that's another question to consider. Of course, because it's already difficult to get people to respond to a 15-minute click here survey, you can imagine there are a lot of people who, because of time, because of interest, because of concerns and anonymity and being targeted and all that, sometimes you would need to be able to incentivize participation. Now, incentivize doesn't always mean money. I've incentivized participation by saying, learning about work-family conflict in this Airbnb setting is still a relatively new thing. And when I get these answers, I promise to send you my final report. And that gets some people interested. Some people don't care. Just give me the money. That's another problem entirely we can talk about another time. And also part of this sampling strategy is, what are reasonable expectations for others? Time, comfort, confidentiality. If you're inside an organization and asking how they feel about the culture and opportunities for progressing and all that other stuff, there's going to be real concerns like, who sent you? And where are you storing the data? And how do I know? And again, these are real issues, not necessarily any more or less important than when using a survey instrument, but as you can imagine, for different reasons, they have different responses in terms of how people feel about responding to your survey. All right. It's okay if I keep going? All right. So you've designed the protocol, you've fleshed out your sampling strategy, and you have contacted individuals who have agreed to meet with you in whatever format that you've decided. Maybe you're over Zoom, maybe you're meeting in their office, whatever it might be. And so this is this is not meant to be exhaustive. These are some considerations in the process of actually conducting the interviews. So at the start, this is very, very, very important. You walk into the room or you walk into the Zoom room and you start with appreciation. Thank you again for agreeing to meet with me. As you know, I am Suzanne de Janasz. I'm a professor of X, credibility. And the purpose of our meeting is to look at work-family conflict in Airbnb hosting. So I just want to make sure that right. So that's important to start off with. Establish the framework, what's happening, etc. You also, in that, before you even begin the interview, and for some of you, this may be, you knew this already, but I'll just remind, managing expectations. So I just want to make clear that everything you say and share with me is confidential. My notes are locked up at the end of the day. Nobody will ever see what any one person says, only in the aggregate. once we gather all the data, we're going to be doing a content analysis and themes will emerge, only unless I would like to quote you because what you've said is very illustrative of a theme. I will check back with you personally. Only if you're willing will I use your quote. And if you allow, with your name, and if not, I'll use that quote as anonymous. So those are things you want to say up front. If you plan to record, and I have opinions about that, you ask their permission before you come, right? I mean, if that's your whole plan for gathering data, I would highly recommend that you check on that first. Even note taking. So I usually sit with my computer if I'm face-to-face or on Zoom, and I let them know, hey, I'm going to be taking notes. So that's clicking that you hear, that's me. And also I'll let them know that periodically I might pause and ask them to give me a second to catch up because I am not recording. I'm just using my fingers as fast as I can. So again, I can't stress enough how important it is to let them know what to expect, what's going to be happening. And the last thing I would let them know, either there or at the end of the interview, is what's next. You know, it's going to take us 6 months to finish all these interviews and analyze the data. And if I come back to you looking for permission to use a quote, it probably won't happen before September. You know, so again, let them know what to expect, and then ask if they have any questions. Is that clear? Is everything good? Okay, can we proceed? So that's all of that at the start. And I don't need to say this, but I will. Be professional, look professional. You know, I know that many of us, and I'm not wearing pajama bottoms in case you're wondering. I know many of us in this Zoom environment, right? We're a lot more relaxed, you know, we're, you know, men are not shaving and women are putting hair in ponytails. And, you know, I would look the part. I would look the part. If you were going to knock on someone's door and come meet with them the same way that you would appear, I think you should do that if you're on Zoom. Again, it's about credibility and trust, and that's really important, especially because the nature of interviews is that much different from a typical gathering tool like a survey instrument. Okay, so as I mentioned, capturing the data, you have options. I don't have time to get into it in super detail, but I will say, for me personally in my career, I have never used a recording device, never. And I do that because A, it's my firm belief that people are more comfortable when they're not being recorded and they'll be more open. 2, it is a pain in the butt, a huge time sink to transcribe said interviews. And if I could take notes during the interview, it's one and done. And I've gotten good. My typing speed's fast, and I've gotten good at using some, you know, abbreviations at the moment. And so it's another reason I don't record, because I walk away from that interview. Now, I tend, if I come to a company and I spend a whole day there, I'll always give myself 10-minute breaks minimum in between people, so I can take a quick look while it's still fresh in my mind. You know, does this make sense? Are there some abbreviations that I won't know what I meant later on, et cetera? So, you know, but I don't record. And you know, another option, by the way, back in the days before we all had computers, is I would take physical notes. You know, I would type out these protocols and I would take notes. But you know, those are some basic approaches. And again, another way of capturing the data is to send the questions in advance and get them back. It's not as iterative. It's not as, you know, relationship building as, you know, real-time interviews. But those are some key advantages and disadvantages of the different ways of capturing the data. And at the end of the interview, again, I want to thank you, Susan, for spending the last 30 minutes with me. I really appreciate your time and your confidentiality, your willingness to share. And, you know, remember, I'm going to need a few months before I get back, you know, so again, let them know what to expect and then thank them at the end. All right, 14 minutes left. I think we're okay. So you have this data.
Suzanne, you do have some questions in the chat that I hope we can save time for at the end.
Okay,
There
I'll
are
go
a couple
faster.
questions there. Okay.
Okay, I'll try to get through this in 5 minutes or so. Okay, And besides, realistically, I can't teach you how to do data analysis in 5 minutes. So I am going to take more of an overview approach. So thank you for that reminder, Susan. We generally refer to the process of analyzing text in order to make some valid inferences as content analysis. And contrary to belief, it's not all qualitative. There are some quantitative components to it. And it's important that you know that, because some people go, oh, qualitative research, oh, that's right, that's not valid, that's not real, that's just, foo-foo stuff. But there are some quantitative components. So what is the process for content analyzing? Well, once you have these handwritten or printed or transcribed interviews, and you've got the tons of them, you go through, you and or your GAs or your co-investigators, and you start looking through and thinking, okay, what do some of the categories or themes tend to look like? What is an analysis unit? Is it a word? Is it a phrase? Is it a sentence? Because one sentence could have multiple themes within it. So, normally for me, the analysis unit is a phrase, something that seems to speak to a particular theme or concept. And the process of coding, so you look at these things and you kind of come up with a scheme where, and sometimes I'll even use different colored highlighting pens. I'm like, this is an issue around leadership. This is an issue around clarity of communication. This is an issue around fairness. It keeps coming up over and over. I don't think it's fair. I'm not getting into that. This is an issue, right? So you start to see it's iterative. In fact, you may have come up with a list of 11 themes. And then as you're reading through these again, like, wow, this kind of, I thought was part of this issue, but it's actually a different issue. It's self-motivation versus my boss attempting to motivate me, for example. And there's reason to believe that these are separate constructs. So it is an iterative process. Once you have the coding, you would ask potentially another researcher or graduate assistant to actually take those codes and note how often do they show up throughout these, so they would take the coded scheme and say, okay, we have 28 sets of interviews, and 37 times we saw this theme of leadership, specifically X. And here's where one of the more quantitative computations, one way to say, yes, we did a good job coding, is you have multiple researchers, grad students, et cetera, simultaneously but separately coding the data. And you come back and you look at how similarly did they code this data. We call it inter-rater reliability. So if Naomi and I are working together and she has counts of, whatever, we look at how closely our counts are, and we can say, wow, we're within, I think what would be considered a good number is 85 to 90% or more inter-rater reliability. There is a formula. Krippendorf is one of the people who has provided that formula. Too much data. But anyway, you want to do this data analysis, and you want to be able to then speak about the results in terms of, here was our research question, and these are the, this came out as the strongest theme, and here are some representative quotes that really support this idea of being a theme. And again, we can go on and on. One last comment. There are some computer-based programs that can take the data and analyze it. And that's an example of various computer-based programs out there. I've not used them, for better or for worse. I think I don't have time to get into it. There are pluses and minuses, but a computer is not a human being. That's all I'll say. But I do know others who have used some of these things. Obviously, it's a lot faster, but faster isn't always more effective. And maybe, and I haven't tried this yet, maybe, a goal would be to someday try to do both and see how similarly we would take that approach. Okay, 2 more minutes, some challenges and limitations. First and foremost, time, right? Rich, wonderful, dealing with these, long arcs and things, but a lot of time required compared to a lot of other methods for gathering data. Another challenge is the researcher skills, right? Once you develop a good survey instrument and you post it on Qualtrics, you're done. Then it's just a matter of analyzing the data. But gathering data via an interview does require some real skill. And so there are ways to address that, like good training and shadowing. I have had graduate assistants sit in the meetings with me and take notes, and then we'll debrief afterwards. And so, you can also create a session guide. Here's the protocol. Do this first, ask that second, make sure you make them comfortable, and so on and so forth, to make it pretty soup to nuts. And also just a few notes on skill. This idea of humble inquiry, and I think that's Ed Schein who came up with that term, is focused on asking rather than assuming. And I mentioned this before, more of a partnership. It's a balanced discovery process. Fight the urge to interrupt and just let them talk. The only time you might interrupt is to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that word, or, what does that abbreviation mean? Those are okay, but say more. This is great, say more. By the way, to the say more, one of the things I've also noticed is some people love to talk and others are like, 20 minutes, gotta go. So I try to manage the time well, but I'll also say, I really appreciate you going into depth on these examples. We agreed to only 20 minutes. Would you be willing to spend 5 or 10 more? And so do that before you end time, but that's a good way of kind of allowing these unexpected paths to happen. And then finally, again, to develop your and other research skills, have that moment of reflection and review, self as well as others. And then last but not least, another challenge or limitation is because of the human factor in this, because of it being interpretation of words after the fact. One of the ways of overcoming some of the data validity is to use multiple methods. And by that, I mean, you might have a quantitative and a qualitative piece, you're trying to triangulate. There are a lot of ways of doing this, but bottom line, interviews are powerful vehicles for gathering data, but they also present challenges. I'd say, having done it, it's definitely worth it. All right. Now, I'm open to your questions. Hopefully that was not too much or too little.
Thank you. I think, Belle, you posed a couple questions in the chat. Do you want to say them out loud?
Thank you, Susan. Let me see here the questions. I wanted to ask, so I have two. One would be maybe a disadvantage or a challenge, I'm not sure here, but is it always a bad thing when we're interviewing with different interviewers and then interviewing with, a lot of time in between interviews? So for example, let's say a set of 100 interviews being done over 6-8 months as opposed to 2 or 3. That's one question. I don't know if you want to
hold on. Let me start there.
Sure.
I mean, it depends. Sure, when you look back at your interview notes 6 months later, it's going to be a lot harder to reconstruct, gee, I wonder what their ideas were, in fact, towards that end, if you have time, when you print out your interview notes, assuming you've done it on your computer, one of the things that I've done is I've put like penned in notes, like they were really animated when they talked about this, or they had a look of sadness when they talked about that, because it does take time. And in fact, one of the reasons why you might have big time gaps is you might run out of money, run out of time, or because you found this unexpected path, you expanded the research question and decided to get more data. So in and of itself, I don't think it's a big deal, but the more you can capture not just the words, but any other sentiments at the time before you kind of put those notes in your folder and never look at them again for months, that would help.
Thank you. And I think the part about, having different interviewers analyze the data, I think you addressed it towards the end. So that was good. And then the other question was, is there a question or two that we could ask to participants in order to, I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but it's just in terms of data visualization later on for dissemination purposes. And I've seen a couple of examples out there where people maybe ask, but it's not really in our field, like in the social sciences, but I've seen questions like, if you could describe, let's say, your experiences in one word, what would that word be, right? And so, for example, I'm thinking of like a word cloud that I could use in social media, things like that. So just wondering if you have ideas. Yeah.
I mean, that's a neat thing. I've seen word clouds too. Of course, I would never do that except at the end of an interview, because any summaries that you present will automatically bias your interviewee. So you don't want to do that. And I don't know that I would, again, try to give them some sense, because you don't want them to feel like, oh, darn, I didn't give them what they wanted. All data is good data. And even some data may not necessarily make it to the off the cutting, onto the cutting room floor, so to speak, but it's still there, and it's something you might use later on. I talk about how I will analyze the data, how I will disseminate the data, but purposely, I wouldn't talk about the analysis. It's too soon, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I got a question directly to me asking if you would be willing to share your PowerPoint.
Of
if
course.
you could share that with the group, that'd be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll send it to you, Susan, and you can email it to everyone.
Okay, and I don't have everybody's email address.
I could put it.
If you put it in the chat or email it to me now, and I'll post it in the chat while you're talking with the next question. We have a question from Greta Roberson, and I think this will be our last one because we're getting to time.
Okay.
Greta asks, what happens if an interview goes off track, something goes wrong, perhaps it becomes too emotional, they become increasingly nervous. What do you do there?
Great question, Greta. First of all, again, recognize it's a two-way process. It's not you sit there and I'm going to speak all my questions to you and you're going to respond. So, starting off with them, making them comfortable, good interviewers are reading the body language. And again, the kinds of questions I ask may be very different than those in a peace and conflict situation where people are worried about their safety and their lives. So if you notice some body language that suggests discomfort, I would say something like, I'm getting the sense that maybe you're feeling uncomfortable at the moment. Am I picking that up? Right? So allow them to respond, open-ended question. Here's what I'm sensing. Do you agree, or what do you think? And I would not always get back on track, Greta. I might say, my job is to gather data. It's not to, make you feel uncomfortable. So I might say something like, if they say, you know what, I'm feeling triggered right now, I'm not feeling comfortable to continue, I would stop the interview right then. Right. And that's part of IRB, right? You're, as the researcher, do no harm. And if somebody is feeling harmed by the process of your interview, I would absolutely say, I'm very sorry that you're feeling this way. I'm very happy to stop the interview. If you change your mind and you want to talk with me again later, or perhaps want to use, just respond to my email, these are options, but I would always, get your head out of your computer as you're taking notes, and notice if people are shifting and, tightening up, raising their shoulders and looking visually uncomfortable, and stop if you need to stop.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And with that, we need to stop. I want to thank you for doing this really, really fabulous presentation, really helpful. And interviews are so important to the work we do. practice too. It's not just in research, but doing interviews well is a really important skill. And you've given us a really great synthesis of many considerations. So I really, really appreciate your time.